My name is Kate Smith, conservator of paintings and head of the paintings lab at the Harvard Art Museums. The subject of this art talk is Herbert Bayer's monumental painting Verdure and the research and conservation work that went into preparing it for our 2019 exhibition, the Bauhaus at Harvard. Founded in 1919 by Walter Gropius, the Bauhaus was a German school of art and design that lasted only 14 years until Hitler's rise closed its doors. Many Bauhaus alums went into exile, including Gropius, who chaired the Department of Architecture at Harvard, and Herbert Bayer, who moved to Aspen, Colorado in the 1940s and co-designed the Aspen Institute.
At just over 6 feet tall and 19 feet wide, Verdure is one of the largest paintings now in the Harvard Art Museum's collections. Herbert Bayer painted it thinly on a coarse linen canvas in oil paint with what he described as a soothing, quieting, and appetizing color. The code of ethics guiding my work requires careful study of original materials to understand them and to tailor my interventions to be safe for them. It also requires me to use stable, reversible materials when adding to a work of art so that my additions are never permanent. The goal and responsibility of conservation is to honor the original intention of the artist. I am also trained to technically investigate paintings, to learn how they were constructed, and today I will talk to you about both kinds of work, conservation treatment and technical investigation of artworks. I'll begin with the painting itself, why it was made and how, and I'll describe this while wearing my technical art history hat. Verdure was commissioned in 1948 to be installed in the dining hall of the newly built Harvard Graduate Center, the first example of modern architecture on the university's campus. Walter Gropius, then on the faculty of the Graduate School of Design, and his Cambridge art office, the Architects Collaborative, designed the center and commissioned many works of art to enliven it. For Gropius, quote, the main thing was to get a close integration of the artwork with the architecture instead of having only something added on, unquote. The artists selected were mainly European modernists, with many Bauhausler among them. At the entrance, Joseph Albers designed a brick relief, his first. Hans Arp contributed a large redwood relief. Ani Albers created textiles for the dorms and common areas. And in addition to the painted mural I'll discuss today, Herbert Bayer also produced a ceramic tile mural running the length of the ramp between the first and second floors. When the Graduate Center first opened in 1950, the student paper, The Crimson, called Bayer's painting, quote, the most inscrutable of the center's artworks. Nobody knows quite what it's supposed to be, unquote. In the same article, when interviewed, Bayer explained the origin of the design was the phenomenon of plant growth in spring. He felt the title, Verdure, quote, was not the best. Instead, he said, there is one word in the German language, Entfaltung, which would be perfect. It incorporates all of unfolding and growing. Though he is best known as a designer, Bayer painted prolifically throughout his career, thought of himself as a painter. He studied wall painting at the Bauhaus with Wassily Kandinsky, producing a major work in the school's stairwell, and then focused on print design. In 1945, he moved to Aspen, Colorado to convert an old mining town into a destination for sport and culture, in what would become the Aspen Institute for Humanistic Studies. There, Bayer gave form to an institution and a community, to its graphics, artworks, and architecture. The commission from Gropius came during Bayer's time in Aspen. He painted the monumental canvas in his studio there, then shipped it, rolled, to Harvard, where it was tacked and tensioned onto a wooden stretcher made for the purpose in the conservation studio of what was then called the Fogg Museum. Bayer was not present for the stretching or installation of Verdure. Instead, he sent detailed instructions for how the work should be cropped by the frame, which was also made on site. To avoid ambiguity, he marked the perimeter with dark lines of paint about 1 inch from the painted edge to indicate the area he wanted to remain visible when the frame covered the edges. The main thing, he wrote, is that the frame on the upper line should almost touch the point of the strong upward shape, and these arrows indicate a detail of the same area in the overall image of that strong upward shape that he's indicating. The precision and care that Bayer brought to the final framing and presentation are evident in all stages of his planning process. This attention to detail is documented in the preparatory studies and sketches, some of which are preserved at the Harvard Art Museums, which you see here grouped to scale, along with the painting itself. Every iteration of the composition maintains the same height to width ratio of 1:3. The artist labeled this drawing, Study for Harvard Mural, which I believe you can see in the lower right, sort of in script in graphite, and added what looks like an edition or series number, 1950/15. I examined this work carefully with my curatorial and paper conservation colleagues, and we believe it to be the earliest iteration of the design, at least in the group of studies in our collection, despite being a tantalizing 15th in a series of who knows how many. The composition contains more color than the final painting. Yellow and blue elements are present in addition to the green and red. The drawing is gridded, presumably for transferring the composition to a larger format. This is a centuries-old standard artist practice. Once a drawing is a complete or the idea captured, a grid is drawn over it, and the same divisions at the same ratio of height to width are drawn on the destination surface, be it a wall or a larger canvas. And this breaks the design into smaller parts that can be copied and enlarged by eye. Of interest here is that the overall rectangle was drawn before the sketch, establishing the dimensions of the composition. The grid lines were added after drawing. This was all established during examination through the microscope, seeing which marks interrupted the others and which layered on top of which. It suggests that Bayer would already have known the dimensions he was meant to occupy before beginning drawing. If I crop to just the design area itself, you'll see that the forms and colors here are echoed closely, but not exactly, in a larger, painted oil sketch on canvas, now at the Smith College Museum of Art in Northampton, Massachusetts. Like the study drawing, the Smith College example has the yellow and blue forms in addition to the green and red. The study drawing is also very close to a small oil sketch on canvas in the Harvard Art Museum's collection. We're going from 14 inches wide in the drawing to 40 inches wide in both small oil paintings, which are identical in dimension to each other, and still much smaller than the final work, which, if you recall, is nearly 20 feet wide. In all three of these preparatory iterations of the composition, the forms fill the space more densely than in the finished work, and more often move past and are interrupted by the edges of the picture plane. It seems likely that this drawing was used to transfer the design to both of these paintings, and then Bayer experimented with palette choices in the two paintings. The Harvard oil sketch has the palette closest to the final painting, and it was sold to the Harvard Corporation at the time of the commission. Evidently, it was what became the approved version, and it was pursued by Bayer. The Smith oil sketch was purchased from the artist a year later in 1951 for the Smith Museum. It seems that one of Bayer's many iterations for this design was seen for its own value, after not fully expressing the artist's concept for the Harvard Commission. Another working drawing in the Harvard collection is likewise gridded for transfer and richly populated with notations about color and color adjustments. Bayer wrote "Final Sketch for Harvard Mural," this time at the bottom left, and again noted something like an edition number, 1950/16, this time instead of 15, making this a later iteration than the other gridded drawing. This one is also small, 14 inches wide, and exactly the dimensions of the earlier drawing, although the grid ratio is smaller. This final sketch reflects decisions and discoveries made during the earlier study phase of preparatory drawing and painting. It is directly related to the final painting in all particulars of palette and form. Bayer furiously scribbled words and phrases such as light, darker, softer, oxide, more brown, interlock reds, all forms move, yellow and more gray. Some of these notes are crossed out, and careful comparison shows that the crossed out ideas were indeed not implemented, while the uncrossed notes were followed in the final work. Deciphering all this felt very intimate indeed. In seeking relationships between drawings and paintings, I examined the Harvard oil sketch and the final mural with an infrared camera. Things appear in color to our eye because of how they characteristically absorb or reflect various wavelengths of visible light. However, there's a vast array of wavelengths that the human eye cannot perceive. A camera whose detector is sensitive to the infrared region can see through many paint films to the preparatory drawing below. And luckily for our purposes, the carbon-based drawing media used by many artists happens to absorb infrared radiation strongly and appears dark in an IR image, while the colored pigments on top become transparent. Using this technique, I was able to record evidence of a transfer grid on the final mural below the paint. I've illustrated my findings here using a diagram of yellow lines superimposed onto a normal light photograph of the painting. Bayer used only vertical lines as a guide, as you can see the yellow verticals that I've imposed, which correlate exactly to the vertical elements on the drawing above. This bare-bones guide would have also required a great deal of freehand drawing in this final scaling up transfer process, which is in fact what I found. I was surprised to discover that despite the careful, iterative planning illustrated in the early drawn and painted sketches, Bayer continued to improvise and experiment with the placement and interlocking of shapes in the final painting. 3 alternate positions never executed in paint were tested in the drawing for the red foliate forms, and I think you can see those in yellow as well. The leftmost form was tried much farther left and oriented upward, as well as more centrally drawn and higher. The right-hand form was initially drawn several inches to the left, but was shifted when it was finally painted. Infrared photography further reveals that Bayer loosely laid out the composition with a dry drawing medium, correcting his lines as he made them. He also added hatching to indicate areas of shadow or volume. Here's an example of one of the sketched-in forms that was never painted. And as you can see, if we go back to normal light, it does in fact disappear when we're looking at the paint surface. And then as we shift again to infrared, this sketching and hatching underneath, it's very, very freeform in fact, despite being so carefully planned for. Technical examinations such as infrared photography and close examination of an object with its preparatory studies can produce what feels like a very intimate view into the working process of an artist. This studio photograph that I showed you briefly earlier shows many of these very preparatory works scattered about the room, a live part of his process. And I have yet to try to match ours with the specific ones strewn about the walls and floors here, but it is a very tantalizing prospect. I've walked you through the technical investigation of this painting, where we learned so much about how the mural was made and how many iterations occurred to bring it to its ultimate expression. That expression is so very valuable, the intention that an artist brings to their work. That, along with the actual physical material of the object, is what I work to preserve when I wear my other hat, that of conservator. And when the materials degrade or are damaged, the intention is obscured or altered, and that is when a conservator can intervene. Here are several images taken of the mural on site in the Graduate Center over the years. The painting was installed in a busy dining room directly over a heating element. This created air currents that deposited grime on the surface, especially along the lower third. Dining chairs scuffed a horizontal band of abrasion the entire width of the canvas and caused several small tears. And in addition, diners evidently spilled and splashed liquids and food on the surface from time to time. During the painting's relatively short life, from its creation in 1950 to its most recent installation in the 2019 exhibition at Harvard, the canvas has been conserved 7 times to address the problems of grime and damage. 7 treatments over 68 years is an unusual level of attention that speaks to the painting's life as a public art installation rather than a museum piece, and to the particular display conditions in Harkness Commons. The conservation cycle began in 1951, just 1 year after installation, when surface grime and food residue were removed with a water-based cleaning solution. At that time, fog conservators applied a varnish of polyvinyl acetate resin, or PVA, as a protective barrier to seal the surface against what was seen to be the inevitable future cleanings to come. PVA is a varnish that was commonly used by American conservators in the mid-20th century as a replacement for traditional artist varnishes made of natural tree resins that yellow and become brittle and hazy over time. PVA is stable, it maintains its clear and flexible properties longer than natural resins, and it is easily removed with solvents that do not put the oil paint at risk. However, PVA is also relatively soft, and over time, dirt and grime are held fast and incorporated into the surface, making normal cleaning procedures less effective. Thus, each time the painting was subsequently cleaned to remove grime and food residue in 1958, 1971, 1977, and 1989, the original brilliance of the palette was never fully recovered. PVA also has a fairly high gloss, contradicting Bayer's specific instructions for a matte finish, which are highlighted here in this letter. It's the same letter to Gropius in which Bayer carefully describes his intent with the framing of his painting. He's also very specific that the surface should remain matte. Ultimately, in 1989, a plexiglass cover was installed in front of the painting to halt further intrusions. When the painting was deinstalled in 2004 during renovations, the mural was placed in the off-site storage facility due to its monumental size. The painting's appearance by that time was greatly diminished and counter to the artist's intention, but without any plans for display, no treatment was undertaken at that time. 13 years later, preparations for the Bauhaus Centennial exhibition brought Verdure to the attention of curators once again. This prompted the most recent conservation treatment, executed in the storage space that you see here because of the size of the work. It simply would not fit into our conservation lab. The aim of this conservation campaign was to present the painting as closely as possible to the way the artist intended it to be seen. The darkened and glossy varnish not only resulted in a dirty appearance, it also impeded the legibility of the composition. The light passages were rendered darker, particularly in the lower third nearest the heating duct, and seemed to recede, while the dark passages appeared hazy and lighter. Overall contrast was reduced and the illusion of volume was lost. This is a photograph taken with ultraviolet illumination. The high-energy ultraviolet wavelengths are absorbed and sometimes re-emitted as visible fluorescence in characteristic ways that can be used diagnostically. The main findings of this technique are that there appears to be a zinc-containing pigment overall, possibly in the lower priming layer peeking through. The characteristic lemony yellow fluorescence that zinc exhibits can be seen in the lighter passages and also in areas of damage as bright spots. Ultraviolet imaging also revealed the extensive splashes of a liquid which fluoresce brightly, most densely along the right edge. The bright bluish quality of that fluorescence implies a protein-rich material, most likely, unfortunately, milk, although we were never able to confirm that through analysis. The PVA varnish, despite its problems, had in fact done its job as a barrier to alteration. The paint had not suffered overall abrasion as a result of the frequent cleanings. The varnish remained easily soluble in acetone and toluene. And I direct your attention to the detail in the upper right, which shows a series of small cleaning tests with a range of solvents. We always test minutely before proceeding with an overall treatment, and this is how we identified toluene and acetone as both effective in removing the varnish and safe for the underlying paint. The solvents are rolled over the surface with hand-rolled cotton swabs to dissolve and remove the resin and grime, lifting the glossy gray veil of the 1951 treatment. It's a very big painting and we use tiny tools, which allows us to carefully monitor the cleaning as it progresses. In fact, it took 4 paintings conservators 4 months, working 1 full day per week each to accomplish the task while maintaining a regular workload of the lab. The cleaning was very dramatic, as you can see. The image on the left shows how darkened and visually flattened the painting had become. And the detail on the right illustrates the glossy effect of the varnish, the specular reflection of that glossy surface from that angle, and the mateness that was recovered as that varnish was removed. Combined with in-painting to integrate small areas of abrasion and loss, the original values were ultimately reestablished. So on the top, you see an image taken before treatment began, and on the bottom, after treatment was complete. The forms again appear to project, recede, and overlap in the illusionistic manner with which they were designed. Now, as before, they, quote, break the wall, unquote, to use Bayer's evocative phrase. One can almost imagine flying through the voids and around the curves in the imagined space.
As I hope you've learned, art conservation is fundamentally about gaining a thorough understanding of the methods and materials used to create a work of art, and of its life history. Verdure is in certain ways a special case because of its monumental scale, its decades of public display in a cafeteria, and the availability of documentation due to its long tenure at Harvard. Thank you for watching.